Hello everyone, Cameron here. Thought I'd do a discussion video. This is my first discussion video I thought I'd do. I kind of felt like doing a discussion video, The first topic is on how and why the Beatles broke up. And I'm also going to be talking about events that could be related to the breakup, that are kind of connected towards the breakup. And basically, the changing times of the Beatles, in the later period, as to the leading up to the split. So we're going to start with 1966. 1966 is kind of when the Beatles breakup story kind of begins. They just released the album Revolver. They were starting to get pretty tired of touring. Of course, early in the year, John had made the remark about the Beatles being bigger than Jesus, and it caused a firestorm in America, and the Beatles were due to go to America to do a tour. They had troubles in they went on a European tour, in Japan, in Germany, Japan, and the Philippines. Whilst the shows in Germany went calm, the problems in Japan started when the Beatles were threatened with death. Some student extremists were threatening to kill the Beatles, and there were protests because they didn't want the Beatles to be performing at this hall for martial arts only, not for like pop and rock music. And so, and then the Philippines was another problem because the Beatles didn't know that they were supposed to be invited to a reception held by Imelda Marcos and her husband, President Marcos, and so the Beatles didn't know. I think Brian was told, but he turned it down, and the Beatles didn't know that they were meant to be at that they were supposed to be at with Imelda Marcos, meeting Imelda Marcos, and so they were accused for snubbing the Philippines First Lady. So the Remarkably Bigger Than Jesus had reached the state on a magazine. This caused an uproar. John had to do a press conference where he had to apologise basically for this remark and clarify it. And basically the Beatles were then threatened with death. There were several death threats on their tour. Particularly there was a very dangerous occasion at the Mid-South Coliseum in Memphis when a firecracker was lit off during the show. And so the Beatles did carry on, but they looked around to see who'd been hit, and fortunately nobody was hit. They got out in one piece. By the time they'd reached the end of the tour, they'd had enough, and of course they did their last performance at Candlestick Park. There were many reasons they decided to stop. They were getting tired, not hearing themselves perform. Particularly on Revolver, there were some experiments they'd done on record that they wouldn't be able to do live, and I don't know if they played any songs from Revolver on the US tour. They probably didn't, but so that's the 66. Then the Beatles didn't do any activity until they went back into the studio in November 1966 to do Strawberry Fields Forever, which was kind of the start of the Sgt. Pepper album, which we all know. And Paul McCartney, I think, had this idea, of they were talking about Salt and Pepper, and then Paul just had the idea of Sgt. Pepper, I think. And so, pretty interesting. I think, this is, of course, an album that became famous with the famous cover. And, so Sgt. Pepper was kind of the Beatles, a new chapter in the Beatles era. It was the beginning of a new era for the Beatles. They'd now stopped touring. They were now a studio group. They were now making records instead of playing live to audiences, which they were much safer in, and that was, of course, the only place they could hear themselves. So, Sgt. Pepper, everyone likes Sgt. Pepper. But then another problem arose with the Beatles. A tragedy struck the Beatles this time. They were in Bangor in Wales, and they got the news their manager Brian Epstein had been found dead in his apartment back in London. It was apparently a drugs overdose, and the Beatles kind of went back to London shortly after hearing the event. I think Paul had already gone down there. Shortly after the death of Brian, Paul held a meeting at his house saying that the group would carry on regardless. And Paul then, I think there was the idea of the Magical Mystery Tour. This is the only Beatles album I don't have on vinyl. I'm still trying to find a Beatles vinyl copy of this album. So this was kind of Paul's idea. Paul kind of directed the film, but there was occasional, bits. There were the occasional help from other people, from Paul. Not too sure who directed the Magical Mystery Tour, but it was kind of Paul's idea, the Magical Mystery Tour film. But when it was shown on Boxing Day 1967, when it was shown on BBC Two on Boxing Day, when it was shown on the BBC, it was slated, it was originally slated. I think it was because there was some section that were recorded in colour that was shown in black and white, but then it was repeated in colour on BBC Two, I think, shortly after, and then years later it's, got much more better reviews in the course of the last few decades and it's got much better reviews. I've not seen the film, so I can't comment, but hopefully I'll get to see the Magical Mystery Tour film, get the vinyl, and I'll get the album, hopefully. And then in '68, the Beatles went to India and they wrote some songs for what would become the White Album. Then the sessions were kind of tension. They were starting to argue with the music production, musical direction. It got bad that their producer Geoff Emerick then resigned from the White Album sessions. He just didn't want to work with them anymore. He was having enough of the disagreements that the Beatles were having with each other. And so he left the White Album sessions. Didn't work with them again until Abbey Road. Didn't work with them again until Abbey Road a year later. The Beatles, I think, were in separate studios doing their own bit. I don't know why, whether it's because it was the tensions or whether... I've no idea what happened. But it got bad. The tensions were gotten so bad that Ringo eventually left in August 1968. He left because he felt two things. He felt like he was not playing great. Everybody was happy. And he felt like an outsider. So one day he just said to John, I'm leaving, and I feel like you three are really close. I'm not playing great. And he went, I thought it was you three. And he said to Paul, said the same thing, and Paul went, I thought it was you three. And so Ringo went on holiday for 2 weeks. Paul contributed most of the drums on back in the USSR. And I think, that... and after 2 weeks, Ringo did come back. He'd had different cards from John saying, oh, you're the best rock drummer, come on home, And White Album sessions were smoother afterwards, But I think that was the White Album was sort of the beginning on the band on its last legs. Then shortly after New Year '69, the Beatles went into Twickenham Film Studios to film rehearsals for some proposed concerts. Of course, they were going to be called Get Back, but Let It Be was recorded before Abbey Road. And but the sessions for Let It Be were not smoother in Twickenham. But the Twickenham sessions for Let It Be were not smooth. They were beginning to fight. They were fighting more over the musical productions. By this moment in time, of course, John was starting to bring Yoko Ono to the sessions, and that was something the other three disapproved of. And one day, George was particularly having enough with the fights with the Beatles. After one day, the fight with John, and there's of course footage of Paul where he's having a row with Paul, saying, I'll play whatever you want, or I won't play at all. If you don't want to play whatever it is, it'll please you, I'll do it. And then I think they were on a lunch break, and then George just said, see you around the clubs, meaning he was quitting. The other, and John's attitude to it was, let's just get Eric Clapton in, to which the other two didn't really want. And so the Beatles then went to George's house to sort of say, are you going to come back? And then George finally, after 5 days, George finally agreed to return on the condition they don't rehearse in Twickenham. And then they just finished the album they were making, which was, of course, Let It Be, or Get Back as it was titled. Then they did the sessions in their Apple Studios in Savile Row, and the sessions, I think, ran a bit better. They were in a much nicer place to do it because they didn't like the cold atmosphere of Twickenham. So they were actually with the session. So they actually liked being in their Apple studio. It was much better, So they then did the rooftop concert on the 30th of January 1969. Of course, as we all know, there's the famous footage of it, which John closed the remarks saying, "I hope we like to say thank you on behalf of the group and ourselves, and I hope we passed the audition." But after a while, there was more tension. This time with their business side of it. It'd been 2 years since Brian had passed away, and the Beatles didn't have any businessmen to sort out their problems and finances. And then John met the American businessman Alan Klein, who'd managed for the Rolling Stones. Ringo and George actually liked the idea of Alan Klein, but Paul didn't want Alan Klein. Paul wanted his brother-in-law John and his father-in-law Lee, but the other three didn't really want Lee and John to help. And then there were more rows. One night they were in Olympic Studios, I think doing something for Get Back or Abbey Road, I don't know. And they said to Paul, you got to sign this contract, and Paul went, it's Friday night, he doesn't work on a Saturday, and Paul just didn't want to sign the contract, and there was a bit of a row. But eventually Alan Klein was signed as a manager against Paul's wishes, But Neil Aspinall, the road manager, said, it was a completely different situation. Paul wasn't there, you know, he completely disagreed with everything. But the Get Back album didn't really end well. They hired the engineer Glyn Johns to help mix the album, but they couldn't, you know, but they didn't really like the mix. Nobody could really sit through the hundreds of hours of film and tape that had been made, and so pretty much just sat on the shelf for a long time. After the sessions for Get Back were finished, George Martin had seen the arguments and tension between, you know, the other three Beatles. He kind of felt that that was the end. You know, he thought that the Beatles wouldn't work together again. But then he got a surprise phone call from Paul McCartney saying that they were going to go in and make another album, and say, ask George if he wants to produce it. And George agreed with the stipulation that they worked how they used to, and the sessions for Abbey Road were better, you know. But actually, in the Get Back sessions, they hired keyboardist Billy Preston for Get Back, the sessions to Get Back, and they were actually better when, you know, George Harrison said, you know, it's actually, you know, better when you know, you got a guest and they're not so bitchy, you know, like with Eric Clapton, when you had Eric Clapton on One Guitar Gently Weeps. But the sessions for Abbey Road were much smoother, you know, much better. There were no arguments, no disagreements. However, John was absent for most of the recording. John and Yoko were on holiday in Scotland, and John had been in a car accident, and which meant he had to, you know, take a week off. He was back in the sessions, you know, but the sessions, you know, for Abbey Road were better and smoother. Abbey Road was eventually released in September 1969. It was kind of the last album the Beatles made together, of course. But then, just a week before the release of Abbey Road, John had done a concert with the Plastic Ono Band in Toronto. And so, you know, a week after the show, you know, he said to the other three, and Alan, he said to, I think, Paul and Ringo, I think George was out of town, and Alan Klein, he would be leaving the group. This made Paul upset and anxious, and so they said, you know, we'll pretend business as usual for now, but John was leaving. And so Paul then went to the studio to make the McCartney album, which I have, but I forgot to bring with me. Paul then went into the studio to make his first solo album, McCartney, which had been recorded, I think, during late 69, early 70. And then the Beatles went into the studio, just the three of them, to make the song I, Me, Mine, which George had written during the Get Back sessions, but, you know, I don't think it was recorded for the Get Back sessions, but it was kind of added onto the Get Back album, Try Again. But they still couldn't get the mix right, and John was then making a solo single called Instant Karma in 1970 with George, and they liked the way Phil Spector helped, the producer Phil Spector helped, and so John, George and Alan Klein said to Phil Spector, you know, we've got these recordings, you want to come up and help? And so Phil Spector came in, you know, he overdubbed, edited the recordings, remixed them, made his own mix, you know, which, as it says, you know, as reproduced for disc by Phil Spector, it says at the top. Phil Spector, I think, spent a week, you know, making these tapes, the Let It Be album, putting the orchestra on, putting strings, horns, whatever on, and editing, remixing, pretty much making the Let It Be album. And it was released in May 1970. However, Paul McCartney was not happy with the Let It Be mix, particularly the song The Long and Winding Road, and despite asking them to change the mix's request was ignored, and on April 10th, 1970, he announced he was leaving a week before the Beatles were done, a week before the album McCartney was released. I think a couple of weeks before the release, Paul was going to stick to his release date of June 1970, but then he moved it back, and the other three didn't really want that, and so they said to Ringo, can you come over and sort out, say to Paul, can you delay the album to make Let It Be have its impact? And Ringo did that, but that didn't really work. It resulted in a massive row between Paul and Ringo, and so the McCartney album ended up being released on the 17th of April 1970. And so, you know, the Beatles breakup kind of ended in a bad way. They went through their solo careers, and despite journalists asking them if they would reunite, and despite having some answers, the Beatles didn't reunite, of course. We all know with John's murder in 1980 and George's passing in 2001, the Beatles have now never reunited. But they've collaborated on early solo projects and some solo projects. So, you know, that's the end of the first discussion video of the Beatles breakup. I'm sure I'm going to do some other discussion videos as well. If you like this video, let me know in the comments, and like the video, subscribe. Thanks for watching, I'll see you again soon.